What's up guys, I'm Sloth here, back with some Magic the Gathering content. Today, we are talking Vorinclex. So, very recently I've made the decision to do every single Praetor, because they're just so cool. Even if these cards have an insane amount of text, and it takes me forever to review them, but you gotta. It's a Phyrexian set, I'm gonna review all the Praetors. So, Vorinclex is 3 of any color and 2 green for a 6/6 legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor with Trample and Reach, and whenever Vorinclex enters the battlefield, search your library for up to 2 forest cards, reveal them, put them into your hand, then shuffle. Then you can pay 6 of any color and 2 green, exile Vorinclex, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery. So the backside is called the Grand Evolution. In its first chapter, you mill 10 cards, put up to 2 creature cards from among the milled cards onto the battlefield. Chapter 2, distribute 7 +1/+1 counters among any number of target creatures you control. And then its third chapter, until end of turn, creatures you control gain 1 mana. This creature fights target creature you don't control. Exile the Grand Evolution, then return it to the battlefield. So the first thing I want to talk about is how big that butt is. 5 mana 6/6 Trample Reach is a really good blocker, with Reach being more important than normally, because if you're playing against an aggressive deck, you want to stabilize. So it being able to block creatures with flying is really good at that stabilizing. And at that point in the game, they probably definitely won't have something bigger than this. So his ETB is actually not that bad, because if you're playing this, you will probably be playing it in a ramp-ish deck, and making sure that you will get the land drops you need to get to the later stage of the game is really important, especially with his 6 of any color and 2 green ability. You need ramp to get to that point. But there's another also interesting part, is that it can get Jetmir Garden, it gets Triomes, because it is technically a forest, and you can cycle these, so it gives you a pseudo card advantage mode. And I think the coolest part of this ability is that once you flip him and he goes down the side and flip back, he will enter the battlefield again, triggering the enter the battlefield, so you get 2 more forests. And at that point, I know you'll already have 2 mana, because you spent 8 mana on a card and then you waited 3 turns, so you really won't need ramp at that point. But it will thin your deck to make sure that you keep on getting big cards and you don't top deck land, which can really suck in a green deck, because green doesn't have much card draw. So top decking becomes really important. But at that point, you'll have so much mana, you won't mind cycling these for actual card draw. Like every other Praetor I've talked about, when it flips, the value it creates is insane. So first of all, let's talk about the first chapter, milling 10 cards and putting 2 into play. Let's say you're playing a green ramp deck. This first chapter is really powerful, because it can hit so many strong things. I got a couple examples. Tyrannix Rex is really strong, Titan of Industry, Defiler of Vigor, Thronebreaker of Silence. These are all really powerful. But you can also hit your own Vorinclex, which is kind of funny, because this would be flipped, so it's no longer the legendary creature, so you won't have to sack the new Vorinclex for that. And then, because it's the first chapter, you'll have the next turn to flip this Vorinclex into the next chapter, and you won't have to deal with the legend rule, so you can kind of just keep on chaining them into each other and just creating so much value. The problem with that is that you mill 10 every time, so if you keep on chaining it, like I said, at one point you will run out of cards in your deck and lose that way. So you can't do it too often, it's just a thing you can do. But the creatures you can get are so crazy powerful. Now the second chapter is also really good, because 7 counters distributed how you want can be absolutely crazy, because most big creatures in this deck would have trample, so you will absolutely go over whatever your opponent has, guaranteed. I can't think of any board state that won't lose to this unless they killed all your creatures. And if they have killed all your creatures, then of course this is really bad, and it feels really bad because you won't have any targets. Anyways, the last chapter is also really cool, because it synergizes both first chapters and the whole theme of the deck you want to play this in. You want to play this in a deck where you play big things, and chapter 1 puts them into play, chapter 2 makes them bigger. When chapter 3 hits, your creatures are going to be so big that they can fight multiple creatures without dying, so you will just absolutely wipe out your opponent's entire board. So I still think that in standard, this is a pipe dream. It looks really cool, but I don't think the ramp is there. to make this deck insanely powerful. Of course, there's this card, Invasion of Zendikar, which I think is actually pretty powerful, and I might talk about it at some point, which is really good for ramp. But it feels a bit too Rainbow Christmas Land, but for Commander, every single Praetor I have seen will be insane in Commanders, because Commander games go way longer. So you'll get more mana, and you'll get more time to go through all of the chat. There is one problem in Commander, though, is that once you play this, you will probably have to wait an entire turn cycle to get back to you before you can flip it. So either they'll kill it on their turn, or even worse, which would really, really suck, is that they wait for you to pay the 8 mana to flip it, and then they kill it in response. And now you've spent so much mana for not much, honestly. So that's scary. But if it does flip, it is powerful. So Shieldred is 3 mana of any color and 2 black for a 4/5 legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor with Menace. And whenever Shieldred enters the battlefield, each opponent sacrifices a non-token creature or planeswalker. Now, 5 mana. Exile Shieldred, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery, and only if an opponent has 8 or more cards in their hand. Now, the backside, I could not find a version in English. I've looked everywhere and I just could not find it. So this is the art, and then the abilities are: Chapter 1, for each opponent, destroy target creature or planeswalker that player controls. Chapter 2, each opponent discards 3 cards and mills 3. Chapter 3, exile Shieldred and return it to the battlefield transform. Return all creatures in all graveyards to the battlefield under your control. So let's talk standard. This is a pretty interesting card because we all seen how strong Lily is, and she has the same ability to make your opponent sacrifice a creature. The thing that Lily has above Shieldred is that she comes in way earlier, which is way better against the mono red that is everywhere right now. Just like Lily, it pairs really well with Cutdown, because Cutdown is really good at killing small creatures, and if you kill their small creatures, then they'll only have big ones left, and they'll have to sacrifice it. It also has an okay toughness, which is really important to stabilize against aggressive decks, just to make sure that she can block, but it's not that big, and if you're against a mono green deck, at that point they probably will have bigger creatures than her, so it's okay. I like the fact that she can take out planeswalkers too, because normally when you give your opponent more options what to sacrifice, it's worse, but in this case, planeswalkers are normally really big, so they will only sacrifice them if they have to. So it doesn't make the choice worse, but it makes it more flexible, because if they only have a planeswalker, then this will give you a lot of value. The problem is that most planeswalkers actually make creatures, so they'll just sack the creature they made instead of the planeswalker. Now, her flip ability is interesting, to say the least, because I think the big problem in Standard is that these 2 cards see a lot of play, especially the Graveyard Trespasser. Graveyard Trespasser is pretty much in every single black deck, because it is so good at dealing with mono red. It gains your life, it's hard to kill, and it takes away the important graveyard shenanigans. So it's everywhere, and it will eat up the graveyard so fast. If Shieldred sees a lot of play, then Graveyard Trespasser will see even more play, and it'll be really difficult to get to the 8 cards in the grave from your opponent. On the other hand, Shieldred is good against Trespasser because it's one way of killing it without targeting it, because you'll make it sacrifice. So that is interesting. And then when she flips, of course, all the Praetors, when they flip, they're really strong. But the problem with all Praetors is your opponents can kill it in response to you flipping it. So you would have spent 10 mana and they can use a 2 mana spell to take it out, which will feel really bad. And then the first chapter is okay. I mean, killing any creature could be really powerful. The second chapter is really good if you're playing any kind of control deck, but maybe at that point your opponents won't have that many cards in hand, so they might not discard any, especially with cards like Lily, who makes their hand really small to begin with. And then the last one could be very strong. If you flip, they already have 8 cards in their grave, and then you killed something, and then you made them discard and mill 3, so there should be a lot of cards in the grave, and it also gets stuff from your grave, which could be really powerful. I think the third chapter is easily the strongest, and then she'll come back into play and then trigger her ability again to make your opponent sacrifice a non-token creature. So I think this card has some potential in Standard, but I don't think it is broken. I would not be surprised if it didn't see any play. but I still think I might see it somewhere around there. Her real power is in Commander. She is crazy because there's one important line of text on all of these abilities, is that it does it for each opponent. So when she comes in, each opponent has to sacrifice. When she flips, you can destroy a creature for each opponent. Each opponent has to discard. And then if you're playing a big game with 3 to 5 players, there'll be way more cards in the grave for you to bring back and put into, especially after you put them through all of this pain. And also getting 8 cards in the grave isn't as hard. Let's say you have 3 opponents, you're in a 4 or 4 opponents. There's way more chances that one of them will have 8 cards in their grave. So it's a lot easier to flip. So I think this card, honestly, is a Commander All-Star. This card is so powerful in Commander, and I cannot wait. I cannot wait to see it. So Urabrask is 2 Vinny Killer and 2 red for a 4/4 legendary creature Phyrexian Praetor with First Strike. And whenever you cast an instance or sorcery spell, Urabrask does 1 damage to target opponent, add 1 red mana. And then you pay 1 red, exile Urabrask, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery, and only if you cast 3 or more instance and or sorcery spells this turn. Now, the flip side, the first chapters. The Great Work deals 3 damage to target opponent and each creature they control. Chapter 2, create 3 treasure tokens. Chapter 3, until end of turn you may cast instance and sorcery spells from any graveyard. If a spell cast this way would be put into a graveyard, exile it instead. Exile the Great Work, then return it to the battlefield. So the First Strike is actually pretty good on this, because in the deck you'd be running this in, you'll have a lot of direct damage. So let's say there was a 7/7. You attack with this, they block, you shoot it for 3, and then the First Strike hits, and then you kill that without losing Urabrask. The 4/4 stat line is not bad. It means it doesn't die to Lightning Strike, it doesn't die to Strangle, it doesn't die to Cut Down. So there seems to be a mid-range base damage dealing theme, because it works really well with Sophilim. The problem with Sophilim and Urabrask is that they're both 4 mana, so you can't curve into each other, but it can still be really powerful, either doubling your damage or getting a mana every single time. So let's say you're in Magical Christmas Land. You go turn 4, you either play Urabrask or Sophilim. Then turn 5, you play the one that you haven't played. You have 1 mana open. You play 3 1-mana spells into each other. So Play with Fire, End the Festivities, Strangle. There's a lot of 1-drops. And Sophilim on themselves will deal 6 damage. And then if you're having Play with Fires, you'll deal way more because it's also double the Sophilim. And then now you cast 3 spells and you still have 1 floating. So you flip this into the Great Work, and then Chapter 1 triggers, and that will also be doubled by Sophilim. So you'll deal 6 damage to their face and 6 damage to each creature they control. That is an insane amount of burst. If you had 3 Play with Fires, that's a total of 24 damage. It's pretty crazy, a one-shot anyone. Of course, this is not going to happen often. You need a perfect hand, you need to survive, you need 5 specific cards for it to work. But I think it's just hilarious. It'd be really fun time. Another good mid-range card for the deck I'm talking about would be Mechanized Warfare, because it would deal 2 damage to your opponent every time your Urabrask triggers, and would pump up all your other removal spells. Another card I think would be really good with him is Reckless Impulse, because Reckless Impulse gives you 2 more cards to play. So it's a lot more likely that you can get to the 3 spells that you need to flip Urabrask. I really do enjoy how the dealing 1 damage to an opponent and adding the red really goes well with the transform ability, because if you're making more mana you can cast more spells, meaning it's a lot easier to get to that point. And unlike all the other Praetor, it's not a crazy amount of mana to flip him. So if you try to flip him and they kill him in response, you won't feel as bad as paying 8 mana for the green Praetor. So I think that's really cool. Now let's say you flip him, it's a direct 3 damage to face. Sometimes you might need that to just end the game. It could also wipe your opponent's board, which could be really important against aggressive matchups. Because the best thing about it, it doesn't hit your board, it only hits your opponent's board. Now the second chapter is just good mana, which will be really important to have for the next chapter where you can just go crazy. My favorite part of the text in the chapter 3 is that you can cast instants and sorceries from your opponent's graveyard also. I think that's hilarious. And the treasures will really help you because they'll be able to tap for any color, so you can make sure you can use your opponent's graveyard if they're playing a different color. I think that's so funny. But the best part of this is that once chapter 3 hits, you get Urbrask back. So his second ability to deal 1 damage and make 1 mana is going to be so handy because you will be able to cast so many spells and deal so much burst. And then at the end, after you cast all that burst, it's so easy to just flip him again and maybe deal the last 3 damage you need or wipe your opponent's board and start the whole thing all over again. So I think this card is actually awesome. I do have 2 problems with it though. First of all, if you play this and then you have nothing in hand, it does very little. You need to have a bunch of cards for this card to be good, so maybe you'll be good pairing with blue. And my second problem is, let's say you play this on turn 4, it doesn't do anything immediately, so if they remove it, you're just sad. You got no value from it. They used a 2 mana removal spell and it's dead. I'm really hoping it sees play because I think it could be really powerful. It would be really interesting to see a mono red burn deck that is mid-range instead of always being aggressive with 1-drops and 2-drops. Instead waiting, keeping a big hand, waiting to play the Urbrask and then just storming off and dealing a ton of damage to your opponent base. I think that would be such a nice change for mono red. So I really hope this card makes it. So that's all I had to say about standard. But in commander, not bad. It goes, if you have a deck that wants to play a bunch of spells, this card is an auto include. I feel like they geared this card more to standard because for each ability that Urbrask has, it's target opponent. It's not every opponent. So it won't be as strong as a card like Shieldred was, but it's still a really good engine that gives you some burst, it gives you mana, it gives you a board wipe, and a Past in Flames at the end, which could be really important. Getting to that Past in Flames in a deck that wants to storm off is one of the strongest things you can do. So yeah, awesome card. Let's talk about mommy herself, Elesh Norn. So Elesh Norn is 2 of any color and 2 white for 3/5 legendary creature for Phyrexian Praetor with Vigilance. And whenever a source an opponent control deals damage to you or a permanent you control, that source controller loses 2 life unless they pay 1. And then also, you can pay 2 of any color and 1 white, sacrifice 3 other creatures, exile Elesh Norn, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner control. Activate only as a sorcerer. Its Saga side has chapter 1, incubate 2 5 times, then transform all incubator tokens you control. 2, creatures you control get +1/+1 and double strike until end of turn. 3, destroy all other permanents except for artifact, lands, and Phyrexian. Exile the Argent Etching, then return it to the battlefield, front face up. So first of all, the stats are pretty good. 4 mana 3/5 Vigilance is decent at best, and her high toughness means that if it's a burn deck or something, they'll have to burn it a couple times, so her second ability will trigger a lot. Now I think her second ability is best as a top end to an aggro deck. Let's say you have a bunch of creatures and they have a bunch of blockers. You play Elesh Norn, you attack with all. Hopefully all their mana is tapped, and they will be forced to block, and if they block, they will lose 2 life, so that could really win games. Or they would want to cast something, but they couldn't because they have to save their mana to not take damage from Elesh Norn. In other strategies, it's not as good. Let's say you're a mid-range or control deck. In those matchups, your opponent will get a lot of mana, so they can use their excess mana to pay the 1, and if you're not an aggressive deck, them losing 2 life isn't that important. In aggro versus aggro, this ability could be pretty strong too, because it will stop your opponents from attacking you. If they don't have a lot of life and a lot of mana, they can't deal that much damage to you before dying themselves. The problem is that if they one-shot you with everything, you won't get the triggers because those will trigger after damage, so you'll still die. Now her flip ability isn't that hard to get in an aggressive deck because aggressive decks, especially white aggressive decks, tend to have a lot of creatures, and sacrificing 3 creatures isn't so much of a big deal because you will get so much power from her flip side. So how I see it is you go to combat, you attack with all. They don't want to block your creatures because they don't want to lose the 2 life. So a lot of your creatures survive. So then after combat's done, you activate her ability and get an insane amount of value. So her first chapter makes 5 creatures, which is definitely more than 3 that you sacrificed. Also gives synergies if you already have other incubated tokens, which you might because this is a go wide board and tokens go wide. Now the second chapter really synergizes with the go wide strategy because +1/+1 double strike all your creatures pretty insane. Let's say you only have the 5 incubates. You're hitting for 15 damage, which is crazy, and you'll probably have more creatures at this point so you can hit for even more. It is one of those feel bad abilities though sometimes. If your board is wiped, it doesn't do anything, and there's kind of a negative synergy with the Elesh Norn because Elesh Norn, the 3/5, she won't be a creature while this happens. So when you flip her, you lose a 3/5, and in this case a 4/6 double strike, but it could still easily win games. Now the last chapter I'm not 100% sure about because this might wipe your board. It completely depends how strong and how many Phyrexians you can run in your deck, but if you can get to that point where you're running almost all Phyrexians, this could be a one-sided board wipe, which could be pretty crazy. But also depending on how many Phyrexians there are, it might also just not destroy any of your opponent's stuff. And it synergizes chapter 1 because those will be Phyrexians, so they won't get killed by this. Also, the ability to destroy all enchantment and planeswalkers can be very strong. Let's look at Mono Way, which is a pretty good deck in this standard. It takes out ossification, so you get your creatures back. And it's also fun use ossifications because the creature exiled won't be killed from the board wipe, so it could come back and give you some advantage. It kills Wandering Emperor, it kills Wedding Announcement, it kills Restoration of Iganjo, it kills the Eternal Rondor, it kills Elspeth, it kills Sarah Paragon. Like, it is devastating against this deck. It's also absolutely devastating against the Selesnya Enchantment deck because every single thing they run gets hit by this. It takes out Skrelv's Hive, which is good and bad because I'm assuming in the deck that runs Elesh Norn, you really want Skrelv's Hive to make Phyrexians and creatures you can sack, but it would also take your opponent's one out, so that's pretty good. Destroys Fable of the Mirrorbreaker, which sees an insane amount of play, so that's also really good. And then once you flip back into Elesh Norn, her first chapter made 5 creatures. So if they survived, you can flip her again and start the whole cycle all over again. So I think Elesh Norn would be spectacular in an aggressive, slightly mid-range aggro deck that wants a top end to just go way over the top and drown your opponents in value. So yes, I think this card is awesome, and I'm very excited to see play because these Praetors that flip into sagas are so cool. Jin Gitaxias, one of the most bonkers win more cards I have seen in a while. So let's start reading all of this freaking text. Jin Gitaxias is 3 of any color and 2 blue for a 5/5 legendary creature by Rexian Praetor with Ward 2. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell with mana value 3 or greater, draw a card. Then you can pay 3 of any color and 1 blue. Exile Jin Gitaxias, then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. Activate only as a sorcery and only if you have 7 or more cards in hand. The Great Synthesis, the other side of Jin Gitaxias, is a saga. The first chapter, draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand. You have no maximum hand size for as long as you control the Great Synthesis. Chapter 2, return all non-Phyrexian creatures to their owner's hand. Chapter 3, you may cast any number of spells from your hand without paying their mana cost. Exile the Great Synthesis, then return it to the battlefield front face up. So this is the first Praetor that was ever spoiled that doesn't have a symmetrical effect, which is really interesting. They're going a different way with Praetors in this set. But I'm really enjoying what they've done here because if you can flip this, you're getting so much freaking value. And I'm pretty sure they will do one for each Praetor in each color, which I'm really excited about because I love this card and I want to see different versions of the Praetor. So Word 2 is actually pretty strong on this card because when you play this, your opponent will definitely try to kill it immediately. So it having a bit of protection makes it a lot better, and you'll feel way less bad when they use a 2 mana removal spell to kill it because they'll have to pay 4 mana for your 5 mana spell. The second ability is just a bit of good value and is really important to get those cards so that you can get to 7 cards so you can flip him. Because once Jin-Gitaxias is flipped, that's when he gets really crazy. So his flip ability is terrible in standard and insane in command, because in standard, if you tapped out, played a 5-drop, they didn't kill it, and you have 7 cards in hand at that point, you've won that game. That game is over. So you don't need all these extra insane ability. But in Commander, to win the game, you need to have absolutely insane stuff. So if it flips in Commander, it's way more important than if it flips in standard. The sorcery speed really sucks. I know the card would be completely insane if it wasn't, but you put this on the stack, they kill it. You just lost 9 mana. If it was instant speed, you could put the ability on the stack. They try to kill it, and then you could put it back on the stack and make sure it flips. But you can't do that with this card, which is pretty good, because if you could do that, it would be too strong. Also, this could be seen as a 9 mana play, where you play it and flip it immediately so you get the value, which that could be pretty strong for 9 mana. So the first chapter is actually pretty strong, because to flip it to get there, you need 7 cards in your hand. So at the very least, it's going to be a draw 7. You have no maximum hand size. And it could be more, because Jin-Gitaxias draws you cards when you play something 3 or more. And it's really good you have no maximum hand size, so that when you get to chapter 3, you can just go crazy. So for the second saga, I also have to differentiate between standard and commander, because standard right now will have so many Phyrexians. They will be everywhere, with this set and the next set coming out that are both based on Phyrexia. So it won't bounce as much as you would, but it's still really powerful. But it is the weakest chapter, because at that point in the game, there shouldn't be that many creatures. But maybe you're running a deck with a lot of Phyrexians, and if you are, they won't get bounced, and your opponent's creatures might get bounced, so they can attack without being blocked. And in Commander, there's going to be way less Phyrexian, because the card pool is so much bigger. So you will bounce so many more things, and you'll have more opponents, because Commander is generally 3, 4, or 5 players. So you'll get way more value on bouncing everything back to this owner's hand. And then it works really well with the last chapter, because if you bounce things that you don't want to bounce, or you bounce something with ETB, the last chapter makes it so you can just play them all again, so you don't care that you just bounced them. And the final chapter is my favorite one, because every ability except for the word 2, it's all around getting a massive hand and being able to just play that whole hand without caring about mana cost is insane. You will win that game most of the time. And if you can cast all these things without paying their mana cost, when he flips back to Jin-Gitaxias, you'll have mana up, and if you cast a bunch of card draw spells, you might have more than 7 cards, so you can just flip them right back and make the machine keep turning. So for standard, pioneer, and modern, I think this card is way too win more. You've already won if you can flip him. But in Commander, this card is a all-star. And pretty much if they see it, they will have to kill it. I would build the deck with a bunch of mana generation, a bunch of card draw, and a bunch of counter spells. And there's some specific counter spells I want to talk about, because they'll be really good at protecting Jin. Force of Negation, Force of Will, and Fierce Guardianship all can be 0 mana. So they target your Jin-Gitaxias with their removal. You make them pay the word 2, and then you counter it. And then each of these counter spells would draw you a card, so you wouldn't lose any value until it's your turn, transform it, and then you just annihilate them with overwhelming value. And that deck sounds freaking awesome to me. And I really want to build it. And I also have a mono blue control commander deck that I'm definitely putting this card in. So yes, I'm very, very excited for this card in Commander. And that is all of the Praetors reviewed. It took me at least 14 hours to finish all of these videos, so hopefully you guys did enjoy. Please like, comment, and subscribe. I'm a new channel. I really need it, and see ya.